At least this family has one daughter worth introducing. My mother said it the way she said everything that mattered. Quietly, warmly, with her hand resting on my younger sister's arm like a benediction. 22 people in my aunt's sunroom, and every single one of them heard it. I was standing by the buffet table with a plate of butter tarts I hadn't touched, still wearing my hospital lanyard because I hadn't had time to change before the drive from Sudbury. And my mother looked at me the way you look at a crack in the ceiling that's been there so long you've stopped noticing it. 41 years old, no husband, no children, living alone up north with a job nobody can explain at dinner parties. Her voice was gentle, almost apologetic, like she was doing me a favor by saying what everyone in the room had already decided. 22 people, not nervously. The way you smile when someone says out loud what everyone was already thinking, and you're grateful you don't have to be the one who said it. I didn't set down my plate, didn't look away. I looked straight at her, past the reading glasses she only wore to seem thoughtful, past the white wine flush on her cheeks, past 41 years of her deciding I was a footnote in the family story she preferred to tell, and I said one word: Everett. A coffee cup hit the hardwood floor of my aunt's sunroom. At the far end of the room, near the window, a man stood frozen. 70 years old. Hands I recognized from 17 years ago, the hands of a man who had held a wall together with his bare will and nothing else. Dr. Gerald Everett, retired trauma surgeon, the kind of man who'd walked into the Humboldt crash site in 2018 and stayed for 4 days without sleeping. He had gone the color of old paper. His ceramic mug had slipped clean out of his fingers. He was staring at me the way you stare at something you thought you'd never see again. Stop. His voice came out like gravel. He turned to the room. Every one of you, stop. And then, in front of my mother, in front of my sister, in front of 22 people who had just been nodding along with her, Gerald Everett pressed his heels together, raised his chin, and bowed his head. Smiling stopped where it stood. But before I tell you why a man who had spent 40 years watching people die and not flinching was shaking at the sight of me in a lanyard and coat from a Sudbury winter, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel, because what happened next? Nobody in that room was ready for it. Gerald set his broken mug aside and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded envelope, soft at the edges from being opened and handled too many times, and he spread 5 sheets across my aunt's end table, printed copies of case records, names redacted. Hospital system identifiers still visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Dates, locations, outcome notations. He had organized them chronologically. He had kept them for years. Every time one of these cases came through, he said, voice not fully steady, I asked who was on intake, every time. The answer was always the same name. The smiling had not come back. It had frozen somewhere in the middle of the room and could not find its way to anyone's face. I said nothing, set my butter tarts down on the edge of the table. My eyes moved across the room the way they always did, the way you can't unlearn after enough years of it. 22 people. Who was looking for a way to reframe this? Who was already calculating what it meant for the version of me they'd carried in their heads for 4 decades? My Uncle Raymond, who had laughed the loudest at my mother's joke, was examining the carpet with the concentration of a man who had lost something small and valuable in the fibers. My sister Cassandra had her phone face down on her thigh, both hands pressed flat on it, like she was keeping it from floating away. My mother recovered the way she always recovered, faster than anyone expected and with more grace than the situation deserved. She leaned slightly toward Gerald. Patient, reasonable. The voice she used when she wanted to sound like the only adult in the room. Gerald, I appreciate your kindness. I truly do. But you have to understand, Wren has always struggled to separate her professional identity from her sense of self, even as a child. She needed to be special in a way that other children didn't. It concerned us. A murmur moved through the room, relief masquerading as agreement. Cassandra appeared beside her right on cue, brow pulled together in the exact configuration of genuine concern, head tilting just enough. She'd been practicing that tilt since we were teenagers. Are you okay, Wren? You seem exhausted. Have you been sleeping? The question was a surgical instrument, neat and precise. It repositioned me from someone Gerald Everett had just bowed to someone who needed to be monitored. Not decorated, fragile, not reliable, overextended, gaslighting refined down to a single question about sleep. I put my plate on the table. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. Something my supervising physician had taught me in my first year of residency in a hallway at 3 in the morning when I couldn't stop my hands from shaking after we lost a 6-year-old and there was another chart waiting. She'd stood next to me against the wall and breathed it through without speaking until I could match her pace. That's the only way back, she said. You do not think your way out of it, you breathe your way back. I walked to Gerald and offered my hand, firm, eye to eye. Thank you for coming, Dr. Everett. Just enough for everyone paying attention to understand that I had known exactly who he was from the moment he walked in. Gerald leaned close, his voice dropped below the room. The Beaumont inquest, next Thursday. The college is presenting. Wren, they're going to call you. One breath. I nodded once. The drive from my aunt's house in Barrie back to the highway took 7 minutes, and I sat in the parking lot of a closed Tim Hortons at the edge of town for 40 minutes after that, with the engine running and both hands on the wheel. The heat from the vents filled the car, and I let it. Outside, the February dark was the kind that comes in at 4:30 in the afternoon and doesn't apologize for itself. Northern Ontario dark. I'd driven through worse. I'd driven through worse when I was too tired to be driving at all, and did it anyway because there was no one else. There was a scarf on the passenger seat that belonged to my mother. She'd left it when I'd driven her home from the airport in November. I hadn't returned it. I picked it up now and held it for a moment, and then I put it in the back seat. The memories came the way they always came when I was sitting still long enough to let them. Not in order. In the way shattered glass falls, you see the whole shape of it on the floor before you can make sense of any individual piece. The year I was accepted to the University of Toronto medical program, my mother did not call anyone, did not put it on the refrigerator. When I found out, I phoned the house and she said, "Well, let's hope you can keep up with it." And I heard my sister ask in the background who it was, and my mother said, "No one important, just Wren." The year Cassandra got her real estate license, my mother organized a dinner at the Keg in Oakville, reserved the private room, bought a cake from the French bakery on Lakeshore that she only ordered from for important occasions. The year I finished my fellowship in emergency medicine in Toronto, my mother sent me a card. It said "Congratulations," signed with her name. No particular warmth, but at least a card. When I showed it to the other residents, I said my family was proud. I don't know why I said that. I think I was still, at 29, still trying to make it true by saying it. The year I moved to Sudbury to take the staff physician position at Health Sciences North. The year I made a decision my mother and I both knew was permanent in a way that had nothing to do with geography. She told Cassandra that I'd run away from a career I couldn't handle in a city I was too proud to fail in publicly. The sharpest memory was from when I was 19, standing in the kitchen on a Sunday morning announcing that I wanted to apply to medical school. My mother looked at me over her coffee cup, and the expression was not anger. It was something worse. It was the considered look of a person who has done the math already and is waiting for you to catch up. "Wren," she said. "Medicine is for people who are built for pressure. Not everyone is. There's no shame in knowing your limits early." Her voice was kind. The way a doctor's voice is kind when they're telling you the results are not good. Beside her at the table, Cassandra was reading a magazine and did not look up. My mother did not need to say anything cruel directly. She could deliver a verdict in the voice of a concerned parent and leave you standing in the kitchen, holding your coffee cup, trying to figure out what had just happened. The verdict had been delivered before I was old enough to appeal it. It was never revised. I placed my mother's scarf in the back seat and looked out at the parking lot. A truck pulled in and idled for a moment and pulled out again. I thought about what Gerald had said. The Beaumont inquest. I already knew what it was. I had known since October when I first received the preliminary notice from the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario. What I hadn't known was that Gerald Everett, who had been on the oversight committee for the Northern Ontario Rural Emergency Response Working Group, had been paying attention to something else entirely. I turned the heat down one notch, reached into the glove box, and took out a photograph I had not looked at in 3 years. My family at Cassandra's wedding in 2017, taken on the steps of the venue in Burlington. My mother in the center, Cassandra beside her, her husband on the other side. Cousins fanned out around them. I was on the right edge. Not because I had chosen to stand there, because by the time the photographer arranged everyone, the space that was left was the space beside the decorative fern. I looked at my own face in that photograph, not sad, not angry, calibrated. The face of someone who has been standing at the edge of photographs for long enough that the adjustment has become automatic. I placed the photograph back in the glove box. The year I was 26, doing my third-year residency at St. Michael's in Toronto, I called home after a night that I will not fully describe, except to say that it involved a child and a decision that was made correctly, and still resulted in a death that I will carry for the rest of my practice. I called because I needed someone to say something that wasn't clinical. My mother listened while I told her as much as I could tell her. She was quiet. There was a moment, a genuine moment, where the silence on the line felt like it might turn into something I needed. Then she said, "I always worried that you'd find out the hard way that you weren't suited for this." She didn't say it cruelly. She said it the way she said everything, as though it were self-evident. Then she said she had to get Cassandra to a school fundraiser and she'd call me Sunday. She did not call me Sunday. 3 months later, the same case file became a training reference used by the faculty at U of T for how to manage rapid deterioration in pediatric sepsis. The residents who used it didn't know who wrote the initial intake assessment. They never do. I put the car in drive. The Beaumont inquest had started as a complaint filed by a family in Timmins whose father had been transferred to our ER at Health Sciences North in cardiac distress and died 12 hours after admission. It was the kind of death that a family in grief needed to understand, and the college's role was to determine whether any failure in the standard of care had contributed. What the preliminary review had found was that the death was not attributable to any clinical failure, but to a system-level delay in inter-facility transfer protocols between the referring hospital in Timmins and our department, a delay caused by an administrative gap that I had flagged in writing to the Northern Ontario Rural Health Oversight Committee 14 months before the Beaumont admission. The documentation existed, every word of it. What Gerald had apparently discovered in the course of his role on that committee was that my written flag had been received, logged, and not acted on by a mid-level administrative director who subsequently filed a complaint with the college, characterizing my recommendation as an overreach by a staff physician outside her scope of authority. The complaint had been opened, reviewed, and quietly closed with a note in my file that I had never been shown, a note that described me as prone to exceeding professional boundaries. I had spent 14 months not knowing that note existed. I remembered the line from a supervising physician in my first year of residency, a woman who had been practicing emergency medicine in northern communities for 30 years and had the file folder to prove it. She had told me, standing in a break room at 2 in the morning with a bad coffee and worse news, "The system will not thank you for being right before it's ready. Your job is to be right anyway and to document everything and to wait." 17 years I had lived that instruction. Every patient I'd stabilized, every protocol I'd pushed for, every winter road call where I was the only physician within 90 kilometers, all of it had been the answer to a question my mother had decided the answer to before I was old enough to ask it. But now, with Gerald's envelope and the Beaumont inquest convened for Thursday, and Vance, Dr. Vance Okafor, chief of staff at HSN and the only person in the institution who had ever told me plainly that my memo had been right and the silence following it had been wrong, now something had shifted, not inside me, around me. The truth I had been documenting alone in patient notes and committee submissions and flagged emails for 14 years had found its own calendar. Thursday morning, the hearing room at the CPSO office on Bloor Street in Toronto. I had driven down the night before and stayed at the Holiday Inn Express on Jarvis because the CPSO office was a 14-minute walk and I didn't trust Toronto February traffic to care about anyone's timeline. I arrived 23 minutes early and sat in the lobby with a tea from the vending machine on the second floor that tasted like hot paper and drank it anyway. I was wearing the charcoal blazer I wore for the kind of meetings where things are decided, not a costume. A choice about how I wanted to take up space in a room that had been arranged to make me feel like a supplicant. The administrative director who had filed the complaint against me, I will call him by his role and nothing else, because names here are not the point, arrived with a legal representative and a leather portfolio case, and the posture of a man who was accustomed to rooms like this going the way he expected. He looked at me once when he came through the door, professionally, assessingly, the way you look at a problem you expect to manage. I looked back at him the same way. Gerald arrived at 7 minutes past the hour, which was Gerald's way of establishing that he was not anxious. He sat beside Dr. Okafor in the third row. Vance had come from Sudbury on the overnight train, which I knew because he texted me at 6:15 a.m. to say the coffee on Via Rail was not acceptable and he needed me to have brought an extra cup. I had. It was waiting on the table outside the hearing room. He picked it up without breaking stride. The hearing began with procedural framing, and then the college's presenting officer laid out the case in the measured, careful language that these proceedings require. The Beaumont family's experience, the transfer delay, the question of whether any systemic failure had contributed and whether that failure could have been anticipated and prevented. And then the presenting officer said, "We have identified a submitted recommendation from the attending staff physician on record, dated 14 months prior to the Beaumont admission, that directly addressed the interfacility transfer protocol gap in question." The administrative director's legal representative made a note. The presenting officer continued, "We have also identified a complaint subsequently filed against that physician which characterized her recommendation as a professional overreach. That complaint was closed and notated in her personnel file. The college's review has determined that the notation was made in error and does not reflect the clinical record." She paused for one moment, the kind of pause that tells you something irrevocable is about to land. Furthermore, the college has received a formal submission from the Northern Ontario Rural Emergency Response Working Group, including testimony from the committee's former oversight director, Dr. Gerald Everett, confirming that the recommendation in question was received by the committee, that its substance was sound and actionable, and that the failure to act on it was an administrative decision, not a clinical one. Gerald did not look at me. He looked at the presenting officer with the expression of a man who has been waiting a long time to say something true in a room where it would be recorded. The administrative director's posture changed, barely, a tightening across the shoulders, a stillness that had not been there before. Vance leaned back in his chair in the third row the smallest fraction of a centimeter and said nothing. He had learned stillness the same place I had, in rooms that needed him to be steady before anyone else could be. What followed was not theatrical. It was procedural and specific, and it took 3 hours. And at the end of it, the college's review panel issued a preliminary finding that the complaint notation in my file would be expunged, that the administrative director's handling of the recommendation would be referred for its own review, and that the Beaumont family would receive a formal acknowledgement that the system failure which contributed to their father's death had been identified and documented more than a year before it occurred, and that the documentation had not been acted on. The Beaumont family's representative, a daughter in her 50s who had been sitting in the back row the entire time, pressed both hands flat on the table in front of her when the finding was read. She didn't make a sound. But she nodded once, slowly, the nod of a person receiving something they had needed for a long time. I stood when the panel was dismissed, and I shook hands with the presenting officer, and with Vance, and with Gerald, and I walked out into the lobby and sat down on a chair by the window, and looked at Bloor Street in February with my hands folded in my lap, and breathed in for 4 counts, and held for 4, and breathed out for 4. I had not noticed, until that moment, that the corner of my eye had gone wet. Later, I would understand that my mother and Cassandra had found out about the inquest through Cassandra's husband, who had a friend in the HSN administrative structure, and that they had arrived at the CPSO building during the 3rd hour of the hearing and been told by the lobby security that the proceedings were not open to the public. My mother had apparently stood in the lobby for 40 minutes before leaving. I did not know this until my aunt called me that evening to say that she thought I should know, and that she was sorry she hadn't said something at the sunroom party, and that she had been wrong to say nothing. I told her I appreciated her calling. I meant it. The week after the inquest, my mother showed up at my apartment in Sudbury. I had driven back from Toronto the morning after the hearing, stopped at the Canadian Tire in North Bay to buy windshield wiper fluid because mine had frozen somewhere around Parry Sound, and arrived home at 2 in the afternoon to find 4 messages from Cassandra and none from my mother. This was not unusual. My mother did not leave messages. She considered messages to be a form of vulnerability. She knocked 3 times, quiet, uncertain. The knock of someone who was not sure they had the right to be standing outside this door. I checked through the peephole. She was wearing her everyday coat, not the good one. Her hair was pulled back without the care she usually gave it. She was holding a tin of shortbread, Walker's, the round tin with the tartan, the kind she bought at Christmas, and kept in the sideboard and served to guests she wanted to impress. I had never, in 41 years, been served from that tin. It was Cassandra's tin. Shortbread for Cassandra's birthday. Shortbread when Cassandra's firm closed a big deal. That tin had never once made it through my door. I put my hand on the deadbolt. 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out. Then I opened the door. I didn't step back. I stood in the frame. Her face had changed since the sunroom. Not in a way that made her look older. In a way that made her look less certain. It was the first time in my life that my mother had looked at me without absolute certainty about what she was going to find. Wren. Her voice cracked at the start of it. I heard what happened at the hearing. I didn't understand. I didn't know there was a file. I didn't know about the complaint. I looked at her. You didn't know, I said, or you didn't ask. She opened her mouth. I continued before she could find her footing. My mother, when she had footing, was formidable. I had spent 41 years learning that the only way to have a real conversation with her was to start it before she'd had time to arrange herself. You had my number every year I was in Sudbury. You knew the name of the hospital. You never once called to ask what I was working on. Not once in 7 years. You could have. You chose not to. She tried to say my name. I didn't stop, not because I was angry. I had stopped being angry about this somewhere around year 4 in Sudbury. In a very specific moment in a break room when I looked up from a patient file and realized that the anger was using energy I needed for other things. What I felt now was not anger. It was the plain fact of something that had happened for 41 years being named. You trusted a rumor in a family group chat before you ever trusted a word I said. You handed Cassandra your belief and your time and your room on the wall, and you handed me your doubt, and you did it so consistently for so long that I think you stopped noticing you were doing it. But I noticed. I've noticed every single time. Her eyes filled. My mother was not a woman who cried easily. Seeing it was not satisfying in the way I might have imagined it would be when I was younger. It was just information. I'm sorry, she said. The words came out stripped of everything except what they were. I didn't believe in you. I should have. I'm sorry. I looked at her for a long moment. You're sorry you didn't believe in me, I said. Or you're sorry that a room full of doctors and a college panel proved it in a way you couldn't reframe. She didn't answer, which was, in its way, an answer. I took the shortbread tin from her hands, set it on the table inside the door without opening it. I need some time, I said. I'm not saying never, I'm saying not yet. Go home and let me call you when I'm ready, and if I call, answer. She nodded once. The kind of nod that means someone has understood something they cannot unsay. I closed the door. 3 days later, Cassandra texted, not to ask how I was. The text said, "You didn't have to make mom cry in her own city. She drove 8 hours. I read it twice, set my phone face down on the kitchen counter, made coffee, came back, read it again, deleted the thread, not out of anger, out of clarity." Cassandra was not a person I would explain myself to. I had spent 41 years explaining myself to people who had already decided what they were going to conclude, and I was finished with the particular exhaustion of that project. 2 weeks after the inquest, Gerald called, not about the college, not about my mother. He called because the Northern Ontario Rural Emergency Network was looking for a physician to serve on the advisory panel for inter-facility transfer protocols, and he thought I might be interested, and also, he said, he ran a monthly case review dinner at his house in the Annex in Toronto, where a group of retired and active physicians got together and talked about the cases that had shaped them, and he thought I might want to come sometime. I drove down on the third Saturday of the month in March. Gerald's house on Howland Avenue, old brick, good bookshelves, the kind of kitchen that had seen 30 years of serious cooking. 8 people around a table, ranging in age from 34 to 77. A retired pediatrician from sick kids. A young GP who'd just finished rural training in northern BC. A former emergency physician who now worked in medical education. Coffee in actual cups, not disposable. Someone had brought butter tarts from a bakery in Kensington Market. I took a seat with my back to the wall. Old habit. I hadn't planned to say much. I came because Gerald had asked, and that had been enough. When the conversation came to me and Gerald said, simply, "Wren has been working in Northern Emergency for 7 years, and I think she has something to say about what we don't talk about," I looked around the table. The youngest person there, the GP from BC, 29 years old, shoulders hunched slightly in the way of someone who hadn't fully learned yet how to wear the weight of the work without collapsing under it, was staring at the table. I knew that posture. I had been that posture. I leaned forward. "The hardest part of Northern medicine," I said, not the version I gave at conferences, the real version, the one I had never said out loud in a room that had enough people in it to matter. "The hardest part is that you make decisions that are correct and costly at the same time, often alone, and then you drive home in the dark, and there is no one waiting there who understands what that costs. And the temptation, after a while, is to start making yourself smaller to fit the space where the support should be. To stop flagging what you see because you have learned that flagging it means standing alone in the flag." The young GP raised her eyes from the table. "I've felt that," she said. "Like I'm reporting things to systems that just absorb them and don't move." I nodded. "I know. Here's what I learned, and it took me longer than it should have, document everything. Not because the system will move when you flag it. Because when it finally does move, and it does, eventually, on its own schedule and not yours, you need to be the person who is right and can prove it. You have to be willing to be right in a room with nobody watching for as long as it takes. That's the job. The job isn't to be thanked on the right schedule. The job is to be there." Around the table, the older physicians were nodding in the specific way of people who had lived this and were glad to hear it said plainly. Gerald refilled my coffee without asking. The good kind, not vending machine paper, real coffee made by someone who had decided it mattered. I wrapped my hands around the mug and thought about my mother's shortbread tin sitting on my hall table, about the photograph in my glove box, me at the edge of the frame beside the decorative fern 8 years ago, about the note in my file that had not existed in any record I could see and had shaped decisions that affected people I would never meet, about the Beaumont family's daughter pressing her palms flat on the table and nodding when they told her that her father's death had not been invisible, had not been filed away, had been documented and fought for by someone who had stayed in the room. I had not stayed in the room for gratitude. I had stayed because there was no one else. But tonight, there was a table with 8 people in it, and real coffee, and someone had brought butter tarts from Kensington Market, and a 29-year-old physician who was starting to hunch under the weight of the work had raised her eyes when I said what I said, and that was something. Driving home north on the 400 in the March dark, I cracked the window an inch. Cold air pressed in against my face, the particular cold of Ontario in early spring, that can't quite decide what it's done with winter yet. I didn't turn on the radio. The road unfolded in the headlights and I let it. I thought about calling my mother. Not then, not yet, but the thought of it didn't feel like something I was avoiding anymore. It felt like something with a date on it, somewhere in the future that I might or might not circle depending on how things went. I thought about Cassandra, somewhere south of me in her house in Burlington, composing another text in her head about how Wren, because I have never in my life been Morgan, I have only ever been Wren, about how Wren was making things complicated. Cassandra would keep composing those texts for as long as it remained useful to her to believe that I was the complicated one. I had stopped needing her to think differently. That was the thing nobody tells you about letting go of a narrative someone else has written for you. It doesn't feel like victory. It doesn't feel like relief. It just feels like extra space. Like a room that was furnished with furniture that wasn't yours getting cleared out, and at first you notice the echo, and then after a while you notice how much easier it is to move around in there. The lights of Barrie passed on my left and I kept going north, another 2 hours. Home territory, where the trees came up close to the highway and the stars came out in actual numbers, and the emergency department at Health Sciences North would be staffed by people I knew and trusted. And there would be a shift for me on Monday morning that I had spent 17 years becoming qualified to walk into. Not because anyone had believed I could, because I had decided every day for 17 years that I was going to walk in anyway. I rolled the window down another inch and drove home in the dark and the cold, and the dark was not frightening, and the cold was just weather, and the road ahead was as long as it needed to be, and I knew exactly where it went.